Welcome to the Shaping Portsmouth podcast. Shaping Portsmouth is a collaboration of key Portsmouth businesses, transforming Portsmouth together. Hello and welcome to another Shaping Portsmouth podcast with me, CEO Dave Humphries, and today I am joined by Jacqui Scott from the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation. Welcome, Jacqui.
Thank you very much for having me, Dave.
So, Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation, something that people listening to our podcast might not have heard of. So what exactly is that?
So Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation are, in our very essence, a charitable funder. So we are part of a network of community foundations all around the country. There's a community foundation for pretty much every postcode, certainly for every county. And we fund community-based activities, really the tiny organisations, the heart and soul of local communities, like Spark Community Space where we are today, which are not household names, and we fund them to do the kind of work that helps enable communities to flourish, to help support people who are facing really difficult, challenging lives, and to reduce the impact of poverty and inequality in their lives.
Brilliant. Sounds like very important stuff, and we'll come back to that. What's your role there?
So I'm Chief Executive of the Community Foundation. I've been with the foundation for nearly 4 years, and my background and how I came about coming to the Community Foundation is as a charity fundraiser. So for lots of the organisations that we fund, I've sat on their side of the table for many years as well. And I was a fundraising consultant for a period of time. And I always find that quite funny because I didn't really do any fundraising. Whilst I was a fundraising consultant, what I did was work with organisations on their structures, on their governance, on how the organisation worked, because all of those things need to be effective before you can be an effective fundraiser, which is, how I came to be leading an organisation in this space.
Yeah, cool. Now, one of the things I generally ask people at the start of podcasts is whether they come from Portsmouth or not. But I think we can already work out that you probably don't from your accent.
I think we can guess that I don't come from Portsmouth, but I come from New Zealand, and so I grew up in New Zealand. My very first job, which I did for 8 years in New Zealand from the age of 16, was working in the housing sector. So in New Zealand back in those days, it was government housing, so it was central government-owned housing stock. We had rentals and we had mortgages. It was very progressive thinking of the government at the time, where they gave straightforward mortgages to people who were on low incomes. And so I worked in that sector for 8 years before I moved to the UK. And I think that from my point of view, that's housing is an incredible sector, because without a roof over your head, it is very difficult to get any other of the aspects of your life working. And when you're working within the housing sector, within the social housing sector, you see that in action. You see the way a life can just start to break down when there's a risk to that roof over your head. So it was very good grounding for me, I think, as a human, and to then in time move into the voluntary sector in this country, because I've seen some of that, the kind of things, the kind of issues that people are facing, and I've sat with those people in the office. So
So what caused you to give that up and move to the UK?
Do you know, I was like any young New Zealander, thinking that the streets were paved with gold here. And in fact, I wasn't young. I came to this country when I was 25, and most New Zealanders who used to so frequently travel here would have been much younger. So I was 25, and I thought that I would, have massive opportunity to travel and, explode the world. And then I arrived, and actually it's quite tough to start life in a new country. And it's one of the reasons why in a personal sense, I'm really supportive of organisations who work in the migration sector, because I'm an immigrant and I know what it's like. And I'm an English-speaking immigrant moving to an English-speaking country who actually had incredibly close ties to the country that I moved from. And it's quite hard, even with all of those things on my side. It is quite hard to start a new life in a new country.
Yeah, and I suppose, when we kind of talk about privilege, I suppose, as not just an English-speaking immigrant, but as a white immigrant moving to the UK. It kind of makes you think about what it must be like for others.
Yeah, and in my years of fundraising consultancy, I did a lot of work in the migration sector, actually, and I just, my heart is very there with somebody who is moving. And the people, I think of Portsmouth City of Sanctuary, for example, who we have funded. The people that they're working with, and they're trying to support people who are, often facing really difficult situations. Those people have arrived in the country at the worst time of their lives often, and then they're trying to rebuild their lives and their families' lives. Years ago, I learned something that was really interesting, that in crisis and war, when people are displaced and they move into a refugee camp, for example, within 24 hours of arriving in a refugee camp, if you imagine everything that's led to you arriving in a refugee camp, within 24 hours of your arrival, people are saying, how am I going to educate my children? And how huge that need to support your family and to provide for your family is, even when you've just been through that terrible situation. So I have a lot of sympathy for people who are facing that situation, and Portsmouth has been incredibly welcoming to people who have, historically, it's a city that's seen lots of movement of people coming and going for hundreds of years. So
absolutely. There's probably a whole other podcast in migration
on migration in
and,
Portsmouth.
I suppose it's a political football all of a sudden, and the way it's being used is not great. And I kind of think back to my policing days and work around things like extremism and especially when the sort of conflict in Syria was at its height and people were going out there. We were looking at the fact that only 10 years before that, Syria was considered the second safest country on the planet. And what's changed? And you start to realise what those people that lived there have now got to contend with and why they're so desperate to get somewhere else. But obviously for you, completely different. For you, it was about travel, but you've ended
Travel
up
and
here
opportunities.
and you stayed here. So what was it that stopped you going elsewhere or going back home? What kept you in the UK?
So I guess I am lucky enough to have lived in London for 20 odd years, but then I had the opportunity to move to fabulous Hampshire. And I think it's an incredible county to live in. It's made up of these really exciting, vibrant cities, as well as this fabulous countryside and an incredible coast. And so I think that that's why I've ended up staying here for quite so long as I have. For me, my home is where my children are. And I had my children in this country. So, I'm incredibly privileged to have two fabulous teenagers. I love teenagers. Teenagers are fantastic. And I call where they are home. So it keeps you very grounded having young people in your life, and they want to be here and I want to be with them. So
I'm probably quite glad to get out the other end of the teenage phase. Actually, I've survived it.
I love all the bonkersness of teenagers. I think they're hilarious. They can be very, very weird. But I love to see the way they see the world. And mine are twins, and so I have this immediate contrast between two people, and I couldn't get two more different people amongst mine. So it's fascinating.
My brothers are twins, and I think they're the same. They're polar opposites. There's nothing similar about them at all.
Interesting, isn't it? I always describe mine as loving each other as much as they hate each other. And they would walk to the ends of the earth for each other as well, but they might just, slap each other across the face when they get there, know.
No, I think, whether one of mine murders the other or not is probably
exactly the biggest worry.
So you've stayed in the UK.
Yep.
Obviously, you've kind of talked through your journey and the work you've done in the sector, and you're now with Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation. So we established that there's a series of foundations all across the country, and kind of what your objectives are. But how does it work? You're giving grant money out to achieve certain things. That money must be coming from somewhere. How does the machine work?
That money definitely does come from somewhere. So there's two main sources of our income. So we have an endowment fund. So if people aren't familiar with that term, what that means is that we've raised money over many years, but we don't spend the money that we raise. We we invest it, and we don't touch that money, but the investments give us income over those years, and that money is used to help keep us running, but it's also used to make grants. And that endowment fund is there forever. So we think of them and refer to them sometimes as forever funds. And that's really important because that money is there to support our communities in Portsmouth, in Hampshire, Southampton, and the Isle of Wight forever. So one day we might not be called Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation, but we'll still be here because that money is there forever. And that money was donated to us from philanthropists, from business, and kind of other types of charitable trusts and so on. And we still fundraise for that. So we still work with local philanthropists and business and so on to talk about how we can support them to leave a legacy of their own passion for their local community through an endowment fund. And then the other way that we have income that comes to us and that we give out as grants is often an organisation or a philanthropist or a semi-government body like a lottery fund will have a really strong sense of what they want to do with their money, what they want to achieve with it, but they don't have the route to achieve it. And so often they would come to us as a community foundation and say, we want to support the poorest people in Portsmouth with poverty alleviation through food banks and pantries and basics banks and so on. But we don't have access to those networks of people. Can you look after this grant money and make sure it's well managed, make sure it's going to effective organisations and so on? And so we operate that as a service to those sorts of funders. And that can be all sorts of things, all sorts of different things.
So how does that element of it work? So you've got your money in, you've got the money that's coming in from your philanthropists, from your endowment, etc. So you know how much you've got to give out. How do you decide what you're going to give money to and not? Are there key things that you will always support? Are there things that you won't?
That's interesting. The things that we won't, essentially we are a generalist funder. And so we fund broadly the kind of work that makes a community a better place to live. So we're all about people, what makes life better for people. So we wouldn't, for example, as a rule, fund, let's say, a hedgehog rescue or, something about protecting deer in the New Forest or something like that. So we wouldn't generally be looking at work around animals. We don't fund work that is proselytizing a specific religion, for example. But beyond that, we are quite broad. We have some funds, as we describe it. Our endowment funds are made up of 101 separate funds. And we have some funds that are quite directive as to what we can do with it. And very often that's just about geography. We can spend that within Portsmouth. But, for example, we have a fund in Portsmouth which is ring-fenced for naval families or former naval families, older former naval families, for example. And so we go out and try and find those groups and trying to work with people who are fulfilling that aim. But for each of our funds, there's one of two ways that accessed. And one way people listening to the podcast are unlikely to see because it's by invitation. And that might be that one of our funds needs to be addressing very specific need, and we go out and find who would deliver that. But more widely, we have funds which are open funds. You can look at them on our website. You apply for them online when they're available, and you go through a process of thinking about, okay, so this fund is saying it wants to improve the lives of socially isolated people in Portsmouth, for example. How does my community group do that? What is the most important thing that we're doing now as a community group that needs funding? And then you go through a process of answering. We ask the questions and you answer them as a community group. How you're delivering that work. How is it targeted? How do you know that it's needed? Who are the people that you're working with, and so on. So a community group can apply for those funds. Usually our grants are between sort of around the 5,000 mark, sometimes up to 10,000. And when it's an open program like that, everybody's doing the same thing. Everybody's going through that process of applying. You need to provide us with certain documentation so that we can check that, that everything's good with your finances and governance and so on. And then it goes into a big pot of bids that we look at. So, for example, we have a fund coming up later on this year. It's called Including Communities. We would expect to have probably 200 applicants to that fund, and we then have to weed it down to, a much smaller number of people. Let's say maybe 30 would get to the point of being considered by an external panel to decide which of those 30 will be funded. And finally, it might be 15 get funded out of that. So it's incredibly competitive.
Yeah.
Incredibly competitive.
And so, I mean, you mentioned that particular funding pot. And I suppose this is my question that I decide tomorrow I'm going to set myself up as a new community charity. Dave's community organisation, wanting to help a particular disadvantaged or marginalised group of people. Clearly not hedgehogs in any way, shape, or form.
Although I love hedgehogs,
but I do too. But clearly, I can't get funding for that from you, and it's not a case of me just submitting a bid. I need to watch for different funds to open or different pots.
Yeah, so you can't necessarily submit a bid on any day of the week. There will be, on our website, we advertise what we know is coming up. So we're an unusual funder in the sense that we don't always know what's coming up because we might be in the process of working with a funder in the background. And like lots of the community groups, waiting to know what the decision of that funder is. But on the website, we always have what we know is coming. And so you can see, if I want to apply for Including Communities, you can see when the window is going to be open for that, so that you can be thinking now, oh, okay, I can see Including Communities is coming up. I can see what they're looking for that. What are the best areas of our work that should be funded?
Yeah.
You raised a point of, today I'm setting up the Dave's community group. And we do fund organisations that are new, but I think I would always advise a new charitable organisation to make sure that they have really gone through the thinking with their local CVS organisation in Portsmouth. That would be the Hive.
The Hive, yeah.
Thinking about what you're trying to do. What are the governance things that you need to have in place? So, for example, we won't fund a group unless it's got any kind of group, whether they're a CIC, a CIO or a charity, unless they have a minimum of 3 unrelated directors or trustees who are not living at the same address. And now that seems like this kind of wacky, arcane thing, but in fact that's to avoid, it's to reduce the potential for fraud, because we've fundraised for that money. Generous people have given us the money that we're giving away, and we're accountable to them and to the Charity Commission for that. And so we have to make sure that we're doing all of the things to ensure that that money is, as best as possible, being handled effectively and robustly.
Yeah. And then, so I've identified that I've got some history as a charity. I've used some
the right
local
governance
funding. I've got my governance in place. I know what I want to do, and you've got the right funding pot open.
Yep.
I put in for that, and I'm up against potentially
Yeah,
200 other organisations.
Yeah.
So how on earth do you decide who gets funded and who doesn't?
Yeah. So I have the best job in the world because I get to give lots of money away to community groups. And I also have the worst job in the world because I have to say no to just as many. And often it's quite hard for people to understand why they've been told no, because they are as good as another community group. And at the end of the day, there just isn't enough money to go around. And this is a huge issue for the sector as a whole at the moment because different funding pots are closing. You know, there's just a really strong pull on all of the voluntary income out there. And so community groups as a whole are finding it very difficult to fundraise at the moment. But I think the way you stand out is firstly to make sure that you do really have all of those ducks in a row, because you can fall down on the governance questions easily. And that's frustrating. Oh, we only needed another director. I wish we'd had another director. And a lot of those things can be resolved. So you should talk to us. If you're in that sort of situation, try and talk to us before. But that would be the same for any funder as well. Just check in what are those sorts of requirements.
And one of the ones that I see crop up in the grant bids we do within Shaping quite a lot are directors or non-executive directors or trustees that are also employees.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And so, you know, for that reason, I'm not either with Shaping Portsmouth.
Yeah.
So that there are, you know, on both our boards, no one is actually employed.
Yeah, it's really tricky because there is a certain structure of community group which is allowed to have that, allowed to pay their directors, and that's why we look for 3 unrelated directors not living at the same address, because there needs to be that oversight to ensure that those directors, where they are entitled to be paid, that it's an appropriate level. I have turned down a community group before because I thought that the level of payment for the directors was too high. And in that particular case, you know, I'm the chief executive of an organisation that sits on £16 million worth of endowment, and their hourly rate was higher than mine. And that just isn't realistic. I want people in the sector to be paid well. Of course I do. It's really important and it's only fair. But actually, an hourly rate for a community worker shouldn't be higher than a chief exec level salary. So, you know, and sometimes we have to be looking at things in those ways.
And you want the money to be going to where it's going to be doing the most good, and
and where it's effective.
You know, I think,
and there's a subtlety to that as well, because it's not always about the most people. You know, we recognise that if you're working with, for example, severely disabled people, that you might need a higher ratio of staff or volunteers working with them, and that makes the delivery of that particular thing more expensive, and we understand that, but we want to know that organisations are effective. I think one of the things that's important for people to understand, to try and sort of stand out when they're applying for funding, is, you know, what have you done to understand the problem that you're trying to address? Because the people you work with, your clients, are the ones who understand that. They're the ones who are walking that journey. So we want to know, what have you done to ensure that what you're offering is really what's needed and wanted by your client group? And we don't tell you how to do that because it's really different depending on what kind of organisation you are and who your clients are. But to really ensure that you know that what you're delivering is the right thing at the right time, because it is easy for organisations to. We try and keep our criteria for funding both broad and narrow, because we don't want it so broad that everybody applies, because then you've got 4,000 people that you're competing against. So it needs to be narrow enough for people to say, okay, this one isn't for me, because we don't want you to spend hours on funding bids that you're never going to have a chance for. But it's easy for organisations to look and say, oh, well, you know, they're doing stuff with older people. Well, you know, we're working with teenagers at the moment, but if we did a project on older people, we'd be able to get that funding. It's not, you know, it's tempting, but it can be quite a distraction operating in that way. And it's hard because the money is such an important factor. We need the money for the sector to be surviving. But I would always say make sure that you're really working well with your client group and understanding those needs, rather than running off and saying, "Oh, we could do something with these guys because the money's there to do it."
So understand the problem you're trying to solve, and demonstrate how you've gone about doing that. But what would be, if there are any others, your other top tips for people out there that are putting grant bids in?
Yeah, I would say think about the other networks that you have, because we always ask a question on what other organisations are you working with?
Yeah.
And we don't insist on organisations formally working together or partnership bids or anything like that. That kind of thing is really, really difficult to achieve. And we're talking about small grants. But we do want to know that you're embedded in your community. As a community-based funder, we want to know that you're embedded in your community. And having partnerships with other organisations helps us see that. And that can be quite broad. It's not just the other community organisations. It might be the police, or it might be your local GP surgery, because they're giving you referrals for clients and so on. And that helps us build a picture of how you're operating within your own community.
And is impact something you look for? Do organisations need to be able to demonstrate previous impact?
So impact is a big word for the sector, and it's really difficult to pin down what we all mean by it.
Yep.
And I'm really supportive of the idea that we need to understand what the impact of our funding is, or for a community group to understand what the impact of what they're doing is. But we all have quite different needs of understanding that. So at the Community Foundation, we have our own framework, and we have underpinned that by our own our own knowledge of other frameworks. So we're always looking at the index of multiple deprivation, which is a bit out of date now in terms of the data, but we're looking at that. We're always looking at that. We're looking at lots of other data points and what is needed according to the data. But that's us as a funder. What we want a community group to think about is, what's the change you're making in these real people's lives? And you can measure that in lots of different ways, but we do need you to measure it. Because at the end of the day, the change needs to be able to be seen. But it can be really different. I mean, I used to volunteer for Riding for the Disabled, and I can remember, working with a young man who had very, very severe cerebral palsy. I've never seen such severe cerebral palsy in my life. And the very first time we got him on a horse, lovely wide-backed horse, and he lay on the horse backwards. So we had him sitting on it, but he didn't have enough control over his muscles to sit up, and so he lay down on the horse. And it was the most incredible thing to see, because suddenly his muscles all relaxed. He was always contracted, and suddenly his muscles relaxed. His face, which had always been contracted, relaxed. And it was the most incredible thing to see. And we were a bunch of hardened RDA volunteers at that point, and we all had to, pull tissues from our pockets. It was an incredible thing to see. And sometimes that's a story that a funder needs to hear to understand it's the life-changing moment,
that qualitative versus the quantitative, isn't it? Sometimes it's not just about the data, it's about those stories.
Exactly, of the real humans underneath it. And I think of the community sector as being this huge backbone of our society. The stuff that's good in our society, a lot of that is held up by the community sector, which is full of people who are really passionate and caring. And that's the story that you have to get across is, you might be running an organisation because you've got a huge heart and you want to help all of these people. And what moves you actually really does move funders as well. And it's really important to be able to get those stories across, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So that is kind of the funding side of it. And if people want to find out how to access funds when different funds are going to be open, what's coming up, what they can apply for, how do they go about doing that?
Yep. So you go straight to our website, or give us a shout if you can't access the web. Website is www.hiwcf.org.uk.
Yeah.
you can always just Google Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation and go to our grants page, and it sets out everything that's available now, but you can also see what's been in the recent past, because if you're in Portsmouth, for example, our Portsmouth funds have all been spent for this year. They'll reopen next year, but it's helpful for you to see what did we spend our money on this year.
And I think also on the website you can see that your impact, and there's some quite big headline figures in terms of, I mean, we're talking $1 million plus a year, aren't we?
Yeah, so on an average year, we'd give out between 1 and 2 million.
Yeah.
And last year it was 1.2 million. It depends on that kind of extra income that comes to us within a year that we want to get out as to how up or down that goes. But yeah, and it's very difficult for us to say how many people that funding has helped, but it's in the hundreds of thousands over our 20-something year history, absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant stuff. But that extra funding leads me on to my next point, because we've kind of spoken about the endowments, we've spoken about the sort of philanthropy side of it, but what can people do? How can people help you with funding?
So there's two main things that they can do for funding. We have a funding program, fundraising program rather, called Give Together, Give Local, and that is there for people who can't afford or are not quite in the position of wanting to leave an endowment donation as yet.
Yep.
And that's a monthly donation. You can go onto our website and find Give Together, Give Local. And that is suitable for businesses, it's suitable for individuals, and I'd encourage anybody who wants to be able to make that long-term investment into their local community to go and take a look at Give Together, Give Local. And then there's the endowment funds. So we have around £16 million under management at the moment, and we want and need to double that. And the reason we need to double that is that the need in the county and the whole area is much higher than what we have been able to make grants to ameliorate. So we know that there is a massive amount of need. I would like not to be in a position of having to turn applicants down because we don't have enough money left. So we want and need to be able to double the size of that endowment. And so we want to, raise awareness of how important this is with local businesses, with philanthropists and so on, about the idea of setting up an endowment fund. And there's lots of different approaches that you can take to enabling that. A business, for example, might not have, £100,000 today to set up an endowment fund, but they might think, actually, we could make £10,000 a year for the next 10 years. And there we have a really nice sized endowment fund that we could do something great with forever. And so there's all sorts of different approaches that you can take. So we're always happy to have a chat with anybody who thinks that endowment donation might be something that could be in the offing with them.
And I think probably the important thing is that if you've listened all the way through the podcast to this point, you will have probably got a sense that money is being really responsibly managed and used to really make a difference within our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Funnily enough, people often say to me, it's quite hard giving away money, isn't it? When I'm talking to philanthropists and potential donors, if they've done it before, they've often realised that it is quite difficult because you have to know, often we're working with people who have made their money from business, and they want to be able to see that the investment they make in the community is an effective investment, but because they've been in business all their lives, they don't necessarily know how to do that. And when they do it, they realise it's quite hard. And that's kind of the service that we're providing for business and philanthropists and so on, is we take that hard bit out, that hard bit in the middle, we take that out, but can still deliver these, incredible, the incredible impact that the community groups are delivering.
Yeah. And it's great stuff. So we've mentioned the website a couple of times in there already. We'll stick the link in the notes under the podcast somewhere. So it's a little note for Matt in the team when he's listening to this on the edit to add that in.
And to
so
check that
people
I gave the correct address when I gave it.
We'll double check it, yeah. But no, and as we said, some when you look at the website as well, you can see some of that impact, where some of the money that you've given out has gone, and some big figures there. So really interesting stuff, and I could chat about the community sector and particularly grant funding and all the trials and tribulations of that all day.
As could I.
Yeah, and I think there's plenty of community and charitable organisations linked to shaping that will be listening to this that contend with grant funding on a regular basis, and it's not an easy thing to be doing. So, some good tips there in relation to that. But before we finish, I'd like to focus in on Portsmouth. Now, we've already established that you're not from Portsmouth, but you obviously know the city well. You work obviously within the county, and lots of links to organisations within the city. But we always like to finish by asking our guests to make a recommendation, somewhere to go, something to do in Portsmouth. So what would be your recommendation, Jacqui?
My top tip, well, I do often tell people to come to Portsmouth because I love it. It's a fantastic, vibrant and exciting city. And the one thing that I always tell them that they must do is go up the Spinnaker, because I love it. I think it's an incredible view from up there. But I think for me, the first time I went up the Spinnaker, looking down, I was lucky enough to be able to see from the Spinnaker HMS Victory and the brand new aircraft carrier in the same visual span. And it's the most incredible thing, because to me that was Portsmouth. That is the history of Portsmouth right there, and it symbolised so much. So I always say get up the Spinnaker, especially on a beautiful day like today.
I love it, because the ships, especially when the aircraft carriers are in, you get a really good view of the aircraft carrier from the historic dockyard. It's right there in front of you. But when you walk through there, you've got, we're talking 1545, the Mary Rose sunk.
Yeah.
And then you've got a couple of hundred years later, you've got Victory. Yeah. And obviously everything that did, Battle of Trafalgar. You've then got just down the road, the Warrior, which is, a short while later. And then you've got that aircraft carrier, and it's kind of 500 years
of history,
of naval history, all in that spot. It's absolutely superb.
It's incredible.
And unfortunately, from the Spinnaker Tower at the moment, you can't get that view of Victory because of the restoration works.
Of course, yes, it's got the cover over it. Yeah.
But and that's a future podcast, no doubt, where we talk about that bit of work, because that's fascinating in itself. But you still get a magnificent view from the tower. And in fact, I was at the Spinnaker Tower for a meeting with Richard, the manager, only recently, and we watched the aircraft carrier come out.
Wow.
We stopped our chat to stand out and watch the Queen Elizabeth leave, which in itself is a great sight. But the tower is a good shout. It is a good shout. So Richard will be very happy that you've given them a mention, I'm sure. But there's a couple of things that people won't know, and actually we've got Richard coming in to do a podcast about the tower, because this year I'm going to say about the 15th of October. It's certainly October is the 20th anniversary of the tower opening.
Oh, wow.
This year. So we're doing a podcast with Richard for that anyway on the tower. But I did notice in the news a few weeks ago that there was the 50,000th person abseiled down the tower.
Oh, goodness. Well, you wouldn't get me doing that.
No. But if the moment takes you, you can just turn up on a Saturday and pay. You can walk in and pay to abseil down the side of the Spinnaker Tower. You don't need to wait for one of the charity ones to do it. But there are plenty of local charitable organisations that you can do a fundraising abseil down the tower for. We threw Steph in the team out last year for Solent Mind. And
love
he
you,
did
Steph. Well done.
But yeah, so if you ever fancied an abseil down the tower for Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation, There you go, Jacqui.
I will be on the ground egging you on, but I won't be up there with you.
But no, and of course, you can go up there for, you can book a cream tea up the top in the afternoon, which is a great thing to do, and the cocktail bar at the top. So yeah, so much with the tat. Absolutely love it. Great Portsmouth landmark, and a really, really good shout. Wow. Loads there, Jacqui. Thank you so much for coming in. Really great to get a bit of an explainer around Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation, everything you do, all the good use that money's going to with different community organisations. We certainly look forward to the Portsmouth funds opening up again next year. So definitely for those of you out there in local community organisations, get on the website, have a look now, get yourselves ready for when those funds open up. And let's see some of that money going to great use in our city. But for now, Jacqui, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you. Very much appreciated. Thanks, Dave.
This podcast was brought to you by Shaping Portsmouth, working to make Portsmouth the #1 UK city in which to invest, live, learn, work and visit. To find out more, please visit shapingportsmouth.co.uk. This podcast was supported by Spark Community Space and Portsmouth Community Lottery.